A new documentary looks at Lance Armstrong. He's raised $500 million for cancer research, but he's also one of the most notorious cheaters in sports. Is Lance Armstrong a hero or is he a villain? Let's dive down that rabbit hole. You can make an argument that Lance Armstrong, for all intents and purposes, for a generation, killed the sport of cycling in the States and maybe elsewhere with his cheating. The most famous cyclist in the world does what we know was wrong, admits to it. That's bad. But because of his cheating, because of his winning, he was able to create Livestrong and the bracelets that you may have worn and everything else. And that raised almost $500 million to help people with cancer. That's right. That's good. So Rick Zamprin, when you look at it, on balance, it's a troubling conundrum. Is Lance Armstrong a hero or is Lance Armstrong a villain?
Lance Armstrong is both. He is both Batman and the Penguin. He is both Spider-Man and the Green Hornet. He is hero and villain. To us sports fans who love the game and treasure the purity of competition, we hate him because he cheated us. He cheated us on all the memories that we have of him, of the epic Tour de France, the record 7 victories, the unbelievable recovery from his cancer diagnosis and the treatment and launching into what was at the time the greatest cycling career that we've ever seen. But as a humanity, raising $500 million for cancer research, helping more than 2 million people beat this thing, that's the hero part of it. Without the villainous actions of his cheating on the cycling circuit, we would have never realized the heroism that his Livestrong Foundation and Lance Armstrong Foundation helped so many people.
I got thinking about this one before getting into this discussion, and the other person that comes to mind, obviously, not for the cheating part, is Terry Fox with the money that he raised for cancer. And I got thinking, would we think differently about Terry Fox's achievements, about his fundraising? Because this was way before social media and everything else. If we learned that Terry Fox had jumped in the van and driven 15 miles with no one seeing him, and that comes out later. Didn't do it, by the way. It's a hypothetical. If we found out that Terry Fox had cheated Marathon of Hope, would we think differently about him, or would he still be a hero? And man, you start to think, I think he's still a hero, and people would probably say, yeah, but he had troubles, he had cancer, he had one leg, cut the guy a break. Well, Lance Armstrong had horrible cancer, stage 4 cancer, almost killed him. I find it much more difficult to not villainize Lance Armstrong than Terry Fox under those circumstances, if we had imagined that. And Steve, I'm not entirely sure why, because
I'm not sure it's in any way appropriate to look at Terry Fox this way, because it didn't happen. And part of what we loved about Terry Fox, and this was the difference. I mean, Steve Fogno actually went coast to coast, but he was wasn't a likable guy, right? But both Rick Hansen and Terry Fox were very likable, which was part of the reason, not just what they were doing, but was part of the reason they were able to raise things. It may say something about the difference in the characters of the two countries as to why somebody who was quite as obviously as brash and as braggart as Armstrong was, where that helped stimulate what he was able to raise. I think Livestrong did exactly the right thing to separate themselves from Armstrong, because I think it would have hurt. They recognized exactly what Rick was saying, the dichotomy in this, and they didn't want that dichotomy to swing another way, to swing totally to the negative and stop a momentum that was great, because in the process of Lance Armstrong setting this all up and Livestrong kind of riding him and his famousness, I won't say notoriety, because that's not what at that time they were riding, that brought the inherent value of Livestrong to the fore. They didn't want to lose that inherent value, which by then had started to disconnect itself from Lance Armstrong. So I think it was exactly right. And I think it's probably wrong for him to try and he didn't try to force himself back into this, but he keeps saying that they should use him more. Well, he hasn't rehabilitated himself, and he's not even close. He is so far from being rehabilitated in the public mind right now, and he kind of doesn't know what the steps need to be taken to do that.
Well, in this documentary, I mean, it's like he says, I don't care if you like me or not. I mean, it's clear he had a chance to rehabilitate some of his image, and he's just, like me or don't like me, whatever. Bubba, what do you think about this?
The narrative in this is just so interesting, and it's just so salt and pepper in some ways. It kind of reminds me of like American Gangster, the guy who gains all of his money kind of in an illegal way, but finds everywhere some way to support his community. Tony Soprano, I mean, we know how he gained his money, but he always at Thanksgiving found a way for everyone to have a turkey. I mean, you think of baseball and you think of what Sammy Sosa and McGuire did, illegally, but raised the profile of the sport of baseball in a time where it needed it the most. And, you could say baseball allowed that to happen. But I think at the core of this all, guys, I believe that Lance Armstrong is a villain. At the end of the day, dishonest, and that's the word that gets me, is that he was not honest in the way that he crafted his fame, and as you said, raised money, millions of dollars, for many that probably needed it, not probably, but did need it. So I still think at the core he is an evil man that used his talents to disguise who he really, really was. And it's funny because he followed a great American hero in a sport that really is kind of niche in North America, in Greg LeMond, who was arguably one of the best of his era. So I find it hard to separate his good and his bad, but at the end of the day, the core of his values, if he had any values, were something that I don't think was very conducive to liking the man.
Rick, do you think that he could have raised, and we don't know, but with his story, coming back from stage 4 cancer that had gone all through his body into his brain, I look at this and I think, could he not have raised money? Maybe not 500 million, maybe 200 million, I don't know. But with his story alone, that he came back and was able to ride and contend in the Tour de France, I think if it had been crafted or positioned slightly differently by necessity, the story could have been maybe not exactly the same, but it still could have been a fascinating, amazing fundraising story.
I think the most interesting thing would have been, the what if is always the most interesting, question that we can ask ourselves. What if he did something differently? There's no doubt in my mind that, in 96, he's diagnosed with testicular cancer. It spreads to his abdomen and brain. Yes, it gets to stage 4. He's near death. He makes an incredible recovery, and he's back cycling. Even if he's not winning Tour de France, he's still there. He's still an example, an inspiration to millions of people who are battling cancer, that they can still beat this thing and go on and be successful. Maybe you're not winning championships, but you're still competing at the highest level. And that's what he was doing. There's no doubt in my mind also that he thought, I can make this thing even bigger. And if I take these performance-enhancing substances and these blood thinners and I can win, maybe I can, be the greatest of all time. The most interesting thing that I think that was going through his mind was, do I want to be the best cyclist, or do I want to raise the most amount of money? I think number one is, I want to be the best cyclist. That has always come first. That was his passion. That's what he was doing. And then when the money was being raised, that just amplified and I think pushed him more to cheat more, to be better on the cycling circuit.
Steve, in North American sports, does this story require him to be winning though?
I would think. I think you're right, particularly in the United States, and the winning is not, it's everything, right? So I think that we don't know for fact, because we don't know because he did win, and he was riding that on both sides of his cancer, right? With the winning, and I think it's a tremendous story just on his own recovery, as was just pointed out, just the odds of that in itself, and the fight that it took, and perhaps we don't know, there's some relationship between the ability that I will not be beaten and his recovery is the same thing that you saw on the bike. I don't think he can help who he is, and I don't think, I think he's quite representative in many ways of a certain part of North American sports culture, particularly south of the border, where it's this sort of me and me only, kind of like this main. We've talked a lot about that the change in athletes over the years and the public persona of it. And that's an individual sport, even though it's a team sport. If you're the individual who is the individual within a bike race, a bike team, then of course it's a little different. I mean, the team is there to support you in so many ways. So I think the short answer, which I just didn't give, is yes to that. I think it was probably necessary to have that level of fundraising. It probably was necessary for him to have won. You can't separate that from the fact that he was going to do anything to win anyways. And I think it's not just the lying. Part of it is what he did to other people. That I think
he's very Jordan-esque in that way. He's very Jordan-esque in that way. He made it clear he would run over whoever it took to get where he wanted to be. Bubba, let me complicate this story just a little bit now. When Lance Armstrong in the documentary, as it points out, when he came back, he was not a competitive cyclist. It had taken it out of him. What if not only winning, but even being able to finish the Tour de France or be competitive at all required him to do what he did? And that then led to, so it's not about winning even now. It's about when we say, could he have finished? Could he have been competitive? And would that have been enough? What if not taking the stuff would have prevented Lance Armstrong from even being able to race in the Tour de France? Does that change the story at all?
I think the stage was already set, was it not, though, with the cheating? And I mean, he'd already gone, had he not gone too far? I mean, he had put himself in a position where the lies upon lies were built upon lies, and the cheating in terms of the drug use just continued. So I don't know. I think he couldn't go back. I think he had probably positioned himself. I mean, the greatest liar is the one that believes he's not a liar, right? So I think that's where he had positioned himself. He was going to go down that road. He couldn't go anywhere else, and his mind wouldn't allow him to be anyone else, because we've seen this, and all four of us have talked to winning athletes. Winning becomes extremely addictive, and that will and desire builds and gets stronger and stronger in a sport that many believed at the time was dirty at all, in a sport where many people who followed the sport outside of North America thought he was dirty in the first place. But yet he continued to prove many people wrong by winning. So I think the whole thing was just a product of him never being able to go back. And he had set the stage for that by being successful, by winning, becoming a great American hero, and saving people with cancer, or at least giving them that inspiration and hope, and raising all that money. It's crazy where he ended up. But I believe it's because of himself, though, his own greed, if you want to say.
Yeah, and to Scott's point further on that, Bubba, if you read some of the affidavits that were put to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency by other people who've been basically caught and kind of, okay, here's the plea bargain, really. When you read those affidavits done under oath at the threat of being charged for perjury if they're false, all of them basically said, we can't win, we can't do this without. We were led to believe, and probably it was 100% true, that we could not win without this stuff. But there is some fallacy in say Armstrong having said, well, it was a level playing field if we were all taking drugs. So I probably would have won if we weren't. Some of the physiological evidence that you also see in some of the affidavits say that certain types of athletes, the ones that are already really, really great, actually benefit in some ways a little more from relative to everybody else. And Lance Armstrong might have been one of those types that actually benefit a little more than other people from those performance-enhancing drugs, certain types of performance-enhancing drugs.
Well, if we're talking a little more, and if we're talking a level playing field because everybody used it, how does Ben Johnson not still have his gold medal? I mean, it was small. And the whole field was taking it, we know now, or taking something. Almost everybody in that final race that year in, 88, in Seoul, later has found to have done something. It's not exactly the same because Ben Johnson didn't go on to raise $500 million, and that would have created a whole other discussion. Rick, we just have a few seconds here. When I used my hypothetical Terry Fox example, good or bad, Steve mentioned about the fact that he and Rick Hansen were people that were unbelievably warm, engaging personalities. And Lance Armstrong is not that. How much does personality play into this, that if Lance Armstrong was warm and cuddly and the kind of guy that everybody just couldn't help but feel warm around, that we would think differently maybe about this.
Yeah, as a society, when a guy is a jerk, he's going to get painted with that brush, and I think we don't cut a person like that some slack. If Rick Hansen did something horrible, which I can never see, but we would cut him some slack. Oh, he just had a bad day, or he snapped, or whatever the case is. But when there's a person who has a pattern of these kind of jerk-like behaviors, we're going to put them in that pigeonhole, and they'll be treated as such.
I spent a week a number of years ago. Steve mentioned Steve Fonyo, the guy who ran after Terry Fox, and I went and did a long piece on Steve Fonyo. And there's a guy, wasn't warm, cuddly, and when he ran into troubles, for better or for worse, probably for worse, nobody came to his aid. Nobody stood up for him. He got decimated publicly, and I think it makes the point that you, in some ways, personality-wise, you reap what you sow. We're going to go to the horn really quickly. You got a one-word answer. One-word answer: hero or villain? Lance Armstrong. Bubba O'Neill, you go first.
Villain.
Villain, Rick?
I'm going hero.
Hero? Steve?
Oh, boy. Villain, 5149.
Yeah. You know what? I'm going to go hero, 5149.
Yeah.
Only because of the people who had cancer, who benefited from him.
Dishonest.
Look, there's nothing about his story that is likable except for the outcome.
Yeah.
And, we could spend another 2 hours here discussing whether in all other circumstances the ends justify the means. This one's one of sport's great conundrums. What do you think? Our Twitter handles have been on the screen. Let us know. Tell us what you think. Comment down below. Subscribe down below. What do you think? Is Lance Armstrong a hero for what he did, or is he a villain for what he did? Let us know. We'll be talking to you again soon. Thanks, guys.